Mr. Brett Sims from the Executive Director of the Office of Asset Enterprise Management. Welcome, sir. We're delighted to have you.
Okay, testing. Got it. Okay. Good morning, everyone.
A little bit closer.
A little bit closer.
There you go.
Okay.
The next slide, she'll flip it for you.
Got it. Okay. Good morning to everyone. Topic today that I'm going to be talking a little bit about is the selection of parcels that ultimately has resulted in the development of some housing, with certainly more to come. So if you want to go to the next slide, please, I'll get started. So first I'm going to talk a little bit broadly, and then I'll start digging into a little bit more details about some of the specific considerations and also the timing considerations, because that's important on the parcel side. So at the top level, this was not a one-time shot. So just to be clear, this has been 7+ years of discussion about what parcels could be used for housing since the 2016 West LA Leasing Act that allowed us to do housing via EUL. There's been lots of iterative processes that we've gone through to result in where we are today, which still may not be the end state. So just keep that in mind. It is iterative. It does continue to change as we move forward on here. One of the biggest pieces of that really is what factors that we bring into it. So at a top level, there's physical factors. So conditions of buildings, locations of buildings, infrastructure and utilities that support those buildings. Those all have to be brought into case. We also have to think about access to the buildings, from roadways, pathways, et cetera. So the mobility aspect of it, where things are located. And then you think about the input aspect of it. And we've worked with lots of different partners. This is not necessarily in priority order, but it is in a way, in the sense that the veteran community is the biggest input into the overall process when it comes to the development of the ultimate North Campus housing components there. But it's not the only factor. We've got a lot of other partners that we've worked with over the years. So we've tried to collate that, bring that all together, and what I'll talk about is sort of that process that we went from a very large potential set of parcels down to where we are today, and what some of those key factors were. So if you want to go to the next slide, please. So I'll talk through a couple of these. I think the 2016 was really the start of the process. You know, prior to that, there was no ability to do the housing on the campus there. So the West LA Leasing Act opened the door for the ability to develop housing on campus. With that, we had the 2016 Draft Master Plan, which had a set of parcels identified in it, close to 100 parcels identified in it, not all of which the preferred alternative was housing, but it could have been a secondary or a third potential alternative that we looked at there. So it scanned the entire campus of where could we put potential housing and identified those parcels. We moved into the next two steps, which kind of ran in parallel, but the PEIS, so the NEPA process, started first. And that is an important piece of the puzzle. That also ran in tandem a little bit to the principal developer solicitation and selection that we went through. And I say in tandem because the PEIS process was going on at the time that we selected the PD team. When we selected the principal developer, one of the requirements is that they get engaged in the PEIS process and to both provide input and take output from that PEIS process as they then developed their development plan for the North Campus there. So I'm going to talk just specifically about the PEIS. When we started with 100 or so parcels out there, the PEIS identified a series of alternatives. Alternative D was the one that was ultimately recommended, which was a mix of new construction and retrofit of existing buildings out there. Other options had different parcels because they were either heavier on new construction or heavier on redevelopment of existing buildings, but ultimately the recommendation was a balancing act. It was trying to get both new and existing buildings into the long-term plan. So the selection under the PEIS was probably the most critical down select of parcels from the overarching list of 100 down to a much smaller set of buildings that would fit that bill of a mix of redevelopment plus new construction. So because it was a mix of new construction and redevelopment, it included both open space, so parking lots, MacArthur Field, et cetera, and existing buildings that would be retrofitted. That fed into the principal developer process. So they were on board as the PEIS was being finalized. They were actually working on 207, which 207 was not part of the PEIS. It was done separately. So they were already working on that, but they were then participating in the overarching PEIS discussions so that they could then frame the actual development plan and the timeline associated with developing those assets under the PEIS record of decision that was put out there. That then translated into what you see as the 2022 master plan update. So there are obviously significant changes from the original through the PEIS, through the PD selection into the 2022 version of the master plan. But even that is still just a plan, and things do change. And I think as we presented probably 2 VCOEBs ago, there were a couple of buildings that we flipped that were earlier in the schedule, that we moved later in the schedule, and a couple that we moved forward in there. And I'll talk a little bit about some of those considerations on why that could happen there. But even now, it is still a plan. It is still something that we're working through. It's iterative, and it can change going forward. Okay, next slide, please. So I've talked a good bit about this, but I do just want to talk about how this kind of all comes together there. So it wasn't a one-time shot, as I mentioned. This is something that has been iterative over a series of different actions to result in where we are now, which is roughly 25 parcels for development of housing under the current plan that we have in place there. The biggest change, I think, from the original to now is we've concentrated all of the housing on the North Campus. That wasn't the case originally. There were parcels on the South Campus, but the decision through the 2016 draft master plan and PEIS was not to pursue that, was to move everything north, do everything housing related on the North Campus there to create that community vision, everything together, not individual housing units spread out across the campus, but actually bring them together in that North Village concept that's out there. That is reflected in the PDE well that is out there. And while the PDE well doesn't include several buildings, it does include that concept of community and bringing everything together so that it's more than just the housing component that we're looking at there. It includes those supportive services that are necessary to bring it into that community aspect there. And then with that, I think we being VA, also have a lot of stuff going on that campus. As Rob can attest to, there's a whole lot of construction and other projects going on. You've got the NCA columbarium that is also out there. So there's other factors outside of what we're trying to do under the housing side of it that also have to be brought to bear as we kind of step through what is feasible from a timing standpoint. So this is up to now has really been talking about the why, like how we got from a big set of parcels down to a smaller set of parcels. If you want to go to the next slide, there's 2 factors that come into sort of the timing of those. So this gets more into the parcel turnovers and actually the development sequence of those parcels. So I will talk briefly about the VA GLA perspective, and then certainly offer GLA the opportunity to correct me or add on to that as I go through. And then there's the development aspect from our development partners. So on the GLA side, you know, their first and foremost priority is operating the hospital. So the operations of that medical center have a wide-ranging impact across the campus out there. That is one of their biggest considerations. And that could take the form of having people in buildings that we're ultimately going to redevelop into housing. So how does that transition of people in buildings today to move them someplace else on the South Campus? You can imagine there's a lot of dependencies, there's funding considerations, there's things like that that ultimately drive when particular buildings might be available to redevelop out there. The condition of the buildings and the condition of the infrastructure to support those buildings is also a big factor. I think right now, as we've talked about in past VCOEBs, the water system is an example of that. It might be sufficient to support a certain number of buildings or a certain type of building, but it may not be sufficient without more investment to support all of the things that we want to do. So that consideration is something that is from an operational standpoint important to GLA and can affect when parcels are available to be turned over there. Parking, access, that's obviously a huge consideration too. So a lot of this development was taking place in parking lots. So you can't just take all of the parking lots out of service at one time to build new buildings on it without having to factor in the parking considerations there. So while it might be a logistical issue, it is a very important operational issue that can affect the timing of when parcels show up in the development pattern there. So I hit a couple of the big ones, but I would offer if Rob or Chelsea want to add anything else from the GLA standpoint of key considerations here, please do so.
Thanks, Brett. Rob Merchant for the record. A couple of the other activities going on that impact all the construction that we have going on campus right now are, of course, the Metro construction project and all of the activities surrounding that right at the front door of the hospital and at that very important juncture between Bonsall and Wilshire, which is that main entranceway to the campus. That work will be going on for quite a few more years. Also, we have a critically important project going on where and that's the infrastructure for the new electronic health record that is being deployed at VA facilities across the country. This is requiring the laying down of new fiber to every building on the whole campus, and there is a lot of construction associated with that. Chelsea and her team have worked very hard to identify new and creative laydown areas to help manage all this construction because, as Brett said, the need to maintain parking for employees and veterans visiting the campus while still having that laydown space to support the construction is very important. We are building a lot of new parking lots, and honestly, it makes me a little bit sad to see that green space get paved, but it's what we have to do. And Chelsea, I'd invite you to, there she is.
Thank you. Chelsea Block. I think one more critical consideration is actually staff relocation as well. So as we turn over parcels, we have also a need to move staff from one building to the next, and that is a heavy lift in terms of relocating services. I think the work involved with notifications and that is the heavier lift aside from the construction projects. So that's something that we're dealing with the release of Building 158. That was a very challenging situation. So again, another consideration as far as the timing's concerned and making sure that we have enough time to successfully turn over those parcels. So that's all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. If you want to go to the next slide, the next piece is really on the developer side and actually doing the redevelopment efforts for these buildings out there. And again, I'll flag a couple and then see if the PD team wants to comment here. First one really is just the feasibility. So the assessments of that. 156, 157, for example, had significant amounts of environmental contamination that needed to be dealt with. So being able to get in there and look at that, assess that, figure out how that can be tackled is important and can affect the timing. If that is something that adds additional cost or time before they can do the redevelopment, that's got to be factored in when that parcel would be available out there. Same goes for the assessments of the utilities. So, I think we've done a lot of work on some of the dry utilities through the trunk line work that was done, but even the trunk line work isn't enough to support all of the buildings on the North Campus. So there's additional work to be done. Being able to assess and figure out where that investment is needed is important. Funding, I think we've talked about this many a times, the ability to secure funding to do the development of it through the various funding sources obviously drives the ability to development. We have, in some cases, actually had to push back schedules. I think MacArthur Field is an example of that, where the funding application was not successful the first time. They were not able to get the development financing needed. So that affects, obviously, the ability to develop some of these. If we put a lot into the hopper in a limited amount of funding availability, you simply cannot do everything from a funding standpoint that's necessary to move these forward. So that's a factor on there. I think Chelsea mentioned or Rob mentioned the laydown space. Again, if you're doing development, both from a VA standpoint and from a PD standpoint of 10 things at one time, the ability to coordinate that on a campus becomes increasingly difficult, if not impossible. You simply don't have the space and the capacity to do all of that at the same time. So those are a couple of pieces of it. I will again pause here and see if, I think Brian was here a minute ago, if the PD team wants to add anything to that of their considerations.
Okay. Thanks, Brett. Brian D'Andrea, Century Housing, part of the PD team. Just a few things I would add to what Brett shared. One is the infrastructure was no small task, and it's an ongoing task. Our early assessments, and we spent months and months working with engineers, was that it would cost nearly $100 million to upgrade all of the necessary infrastructure. You're talking about systems that are 80 to 100 years old. The VA has stepped up to the plate and moved mountains to improve the infrastructure, make the connections necessary. Clearly, there's backbones that have gone in, and like Brett said, there's more work to do. But that constraint has largely been addressed, and we appreciate the VA's work on that front. Secondly, on the funding, and I think this is something that came up yesterday, it takes years to stack the capital. We weren't granted a blank check by the federal government to build this housing, and so we're relying on both private and public funding programs, city, county, state, et cetera. Each of those programs have different application cycles. They have different requirements in terms of affordability, in terms of population, and it's one of the constraints that we're managing to. I think you heard from HUD yesterday on the AMI issue, and unfortunately, it's not just a matter of the tax credit programs regulations as it relates to affordability. We're bound by the affordability requirements of all of the other funding sources that we rely on to build out our development budgets. And lastly, and Brett just alluded this, but on the logistics front, there is a lot of work happening on the North Campus right now. So laydown, access, circulation, these are all major issues that we're grappling with on an ongoing basis. I think we have four, between the PD and Core, we have 4 live construction projects. We'll break ground on 2 more by the end of the year between MacArthur B and 158, not to mention all of the surrounding infrastructure work that the VA and its contractors are doing. So that has been a 3D chess match trying to figure all that out. And it's been, I think, a great partnership with the VA to make that happen.
Thank you, Brian. Okay, that is all the slides that I had prepared, so I will stop there and open it up to any questions.
Mr. Allman.
Brett, how you doing? Thanks for coming. It's good to meet in person. I think before we've only done things virtually. You mentioned the PEIS quite a few times, and so because I know a lot of people haven't read this particular section, so I just want to read it, I guess, into the record. This is page 59 of the PDF, and so it says, Alternative D also includes the construction of approximately 680,850 square feet of additional buildings on currently vacant or underutilized land to accommodate new supportive housing for homeless veterans. The current locations considered for new building construction include MacArthur Field, Heroes Golf Course, the northeast corner of Veterans Barrington Park, a parcel between the golf course and Veterans Barrington Park, and/or open land south of the Calvet facility. In addition, up to an additional 450,000 square feet of new construction is projected for the development of a new multi-use town center on existing vacant land and parking lots. Because you mentioned the PEIS a lot, there's some changes with respect to Master Plan 2022, where we see housing in areas that weren't identified in the PEIS. So for example, we see permanent supportive housing in the previous town center area, but we don't see housing on the golf course. What consideration was made in Master Plan 2022 that changed?
So I would say that it's not one consideration, it's a lot of considerations. I mean, infrastructure is an example of that.
So we didn't have any infrastructure, right? I mean, we only had infrastructure to sustain 233 units, and everything after that has to be put in place. So we have to put in new infrastructure anyway, right?
In some cases, not all, but in some.
Right, to a certain extent. Most of the infrastructure for the housing will be fairly new. If we're talking about building 1,200 units, and we were only able to get 233 units permitted, most of the infrastructure is going to be new, I assume. I mean, you would know better than me, right?
Or expanded.
Expanded, that's a better way to describe it. So, with respect to the infrastructure, the principal developer just mentioned it's going to cost at least $100 million. Well, thankfully, in February, we heard that VA committed $361 million at least, with potentially more money on the table. So, thank God for that. Otherwise, we would have been stuck. And I wanted to talk about this in June. I had reached out, and so I'm sorry that this is going to be new. Did you get the handout over here?
I don't have a copy.
Okay. Sorry. So for members of the public, this is going to come up later. We couldn't get these slides into the deck, but we have the parcel release schedule. So this is as of August 1st, which I think is a great document. It's super helpful in terms of understanding where VA is in the parcel release process, the status of each building. It's a great document. However, I think it's hard for people who are not super familiar with the campus to spatially recognize where these buildings are in relation to one another. So I created a map to help people visualize everything that's going on. And again, this is not a VA map. This is something I created, and there's a legend. So the two primary colors identify the projects that get VA to 1,200 units, or 1,215 in this case, and they're identified as green. And then those that are in the potential category, over 1,215 units, which are identified in blue. And then there are subcategories within active. So for example, you see a black circle around 209, which has been open for quite a while. 207, 205, 208 are yellow, lease up in progress. We have MacArthur Field 1, 402, 156, 157, and 404 in construction. Everything looks great. Same with 158 in MacArthur Field 2. Preliminary planning. Building 300 looks great. And again, this is just my opinion. 210. To me, I think we have a critical decision to make with respect to 408. So 408 is set to be released according to the schedule in May of 2024. So a couple issues with 408. This federal advisory committee has mentioned concerns regarding selection and legal authority. VA has issued this ULI report. The final report is still not available yet. Hopefully we'll have that soon. But put all those things aside, those three issues aside. If you just look at the map here, just by the color code, VA by its own standard is saying it may or may not complete the town center. Right, so 410 is in the potential category. Right, so may or may not. Is that fair?
Well, I don't think it's fair because it's what are you defining as the town center?
Well, Master Plan 2022 defines the town center as buildings 410, 407, 408, 409, and 13. Master Plan 2022, the town center concept is around this Main Street idea, right? So if VA is telling us we may not build 410, we may not finish the town center. This is according to the Master Plan 2022, not talking about 2016 at all whatsoever. But further, if we go north of Nimitz, according to the current parcel release schedule, 257 and 206 remain potentially undeveloped. So we have a hole in the northern community. And so when I've been telling people, I'm concerned that we're Swiss cheesing the campus, I think we're starting things here and there without finishing what we started. And I think prior to February, there was a very legitimate rationale as to why that was the case, because we didn't have the funding. Everything was out of cycle. We'll get money here, we'll get money there. It's going to be hard to move things around. But when February came and we heard the great news that VA had invested $361 million, we have money now to operationalize a plan that I think should be comprehensive. And I'm concerned that the current list doesn't quite get there. And so I just want to propose an alternative and just see what you think as far as the considerations, because I agree, parking, lay down, staff location, all legitimate issues, with all the other construction projects going on in the campus. So do we have the other parcel list? Now, the parcel list is just a visualization. It doesn't specify what the release schedule would look like. I think that's, this is more for feedback, and VA can think about it or not think about it. And again, I apologize to members of the public, but I think they'll see it later today when we address the recommendations. Thanks. So there, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. Are you finished?
I was going to just go over the alternative list real quick. So,
Yeah, go ahead.
so in this scenario, everything is largely the same with respect to three different areas that differ. So what this does is it puts all Master Plan 2022 Town Center projects in the potential category. It's not saying we'll never do it. It's not saying don't ever do it. It's just saying we're not quite there yet. We have issues that I think we need to work out prior to moving forward. So in the interim, this addresses, I think, two things. It fills in 257 and 206 so that the northern residential community for chronically homeless veterans is complete. So everything north of Nimitz is filled in, right? And those residents would receive their supportive services based around Building 300. So to me, this looks more complete. We hold 410, 407, 408, 409, 13 for the time being, which I think could be critical swing space if you're talking about needing space for parking, lay down facilities. We're keeping this area open so that we can fill the complete the northern community. And then we move 413, 414, 415 into the active list. Now, some people might say, well, this looks disconnected. Why would this cluster be not with the other northern residential community? And the answer to that is I think that this area is potentially ripe to serve a different population of veterans, right? So the EUL program, you're authorized currently to house not only chronically homeless or homeless veterans, but veterans who are at risk, correct?
Correct.
Right. And so a few months ago, I asked, how does VA define an at-risk veteran of homelessness? And it wasn't really clear at the time. And so the one thing I think we're going to propose later today is, I think that the secretary should deem student veterans in the local community college system to be at risk because the California community colleges are saying that 1 in 5 students in the LA district are homeless or at risk of homelessness. And so I think that while the northern residential community focused around Building 300 for supportive services addresses the chronically homeless population, this trio of buildings could be a radically new idea for VA in terms of addressing the needs of student veterans who may be at risk due to the housing scarcity in Los Angeles. So they are different by design. And so the one thing I would throw out there is, well, financing concerns, right? Are these veterans going to be eligible for HUD-VASH? Probably not, but they are eligible for the GI Bill, which comes with the monthly housing allowance that can be treated similarly to HUD-VASH. And with respect to the capital cost, the California Community College system is spending millions, hundreds of millions of dollars right now trying to secure housing for their student population. So I realize that this is a lot of information and it's radically different, but I think it's something to consider. And obviously, this is all new information. I don't expect a response. I think that this is a cleaner approach until we finalize what's going on in the middle. That's my opinion.
Understood. Okay, no comment there other than it's brand new to you. I know it's new
Understood what you
to
said.
that, so, okay. Mr. Bagley.
Good morning, Brett. As Anthony said, I think that the development of the parcel release schedule a couple years ago, about a year and a half ago, was a great way to go about this because it allowed you guys to do a lot more forecasting and to share it with us. I have a lot of the same concerns that Anthony raised, but I'm going to tackle them a little differently, which is, and you've probably heard this from me before, as a planning exercise, the master plan is kind of like the strategic plan that we're all obligated to follow until something better or different comes along. And it committed to an estimate of 1,200 units, approximately 1,200 units of housing. It's super important that we have a plan that redevelops the campus, assuming no more than 1,200 units of housing are built by the principal developer. I know that sounds trite to probably say, but the reason I think it becomes important is I need to know what currently would VA would propose to do with 206 and 257 if they were not redeveloped as housing.
So I can ask Rob and Chelsea if they have anything, but I mean, I think the short answer is to be developed for housing. It means that VA has no use for it. So it would be a vacant building sitting on the campus that's what it would be.
Rob, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no one's in the buildings right now, right,
So
Rob?
currently 257, the Homeless Veteran Welcome Center was relocated to the South Campus in 402, I believe. I'm sorry, Anthony Allman for the record. We have the Oasis Women's Program, which is something that this Federal Advisory Committee really challenged VA to get, more transitional housing for female veterans, but the vendor that VA selected can't staff, and I believe that program is less than 50% capacity. Sally, would you know? And then I believe there's some HUD-VASH offices in there. And 206, I believe currently is still the Veterans Legal Clinic. Did they move? Okay, they moved. Yeah, I'm not sure what's left in 206.
I guess my general point is, I'm thinking about this from the point of view of asset management. You have an old structure, and it sounds like no plans under the 1,200 unit goal for it to be improved. And while I appreciate that those buildings are being put to use currently, if we just step back and think about like development, it would be crazy to end up in an outcome where we have the entirety of the North Campus developed with beautiful rehab buildings and two buildings that were not. It just strikes me as a matter of good planning, we ought to be looking for a way to get the entirety of that area above Nimitz redeveloped with the 1,200 unit goal. I don't think we should count on the expansion of a master plan beyond 1,200 units. There's a lively debate about the level of HUD-VASH voucher utilization in LA and whether it ought to be, actually, we all know it ought to be higher. The question will be, once it gets higher, what level of residual need is there for permanent supportive housing? And there's a lively debate about the level of funding that LA is going to make available in the next few years. So you've heard this from me before. I just think 1,200 units is the goal. And I think we ought to have a plan for everything north of Nimitz within that goal of 1,200 units. So, I mean, has the principal developer come to you and said they're not willing to redevelop 206 or 257?
No. And I would say, just from a spatial awareness standpoint, the blue is still part of the plan. I understand your position that it shouldn't be, but it is part of the plan because it's a minimum of 1,200 units. So in our mind, we don't have a crystal ball, like I don't think anyone does, of what the demand will look like 3, 4, 5, 6 years from now, and whether 1,200 is the right number. So 1,200 is sort of the floor, the minimum. We feel it's in the best interest to have a plan that goes above that up to the PEIS level that was assessed, which was the 1691 or somewhere in that area there. So this has nothing to do with the PD not being willing to develop it. It is in the plan. It's just called potential because it exceeds the 1,200, and we can't see the need aspect beyond 1,200 at this point. We will at some point as these things flesh out and more housing becomes available, whatever happens with HUD-VASH, as that becomes more clear. It's our take that having a plan that accounts for that is better than having no plan and reacting to it.
From your point of view, is there anything about the characteristics of those two buildings, 205 or 257, that makes them unsuitable for housing?
I'm not an architectural expert, but I would say there's very few buildings that you can't turn into housing. So I don't think it's that piece of it, but there could be other components in there that I'm not aware of that make it less ideal, but I think it could be developed as housing as we've got planned now.
I think we'll probably be offering a recommendation along these lines. I'd really encourage you to think about prioritizing those two with the principal developer as within the 1,200 unit goal.
Understood.
Really appreciate it.
Jim Zenner.
Jim Zenner, thanks for the presentation. First of all, I don't think any of us would agree that housing should be held up. I mean, I think this is a great alternative, but this doesn't hold up housing. We don't propose that. I don't think any of us do, I hope. So security in these contracts with the principal sorry, I suck at this. Thank you, Rob. So in the contracts with the PD, is security mandatory, or what does that look like?
So in a general sense, security of the buildings themselves, the UL premise, is required. So they're responsible for that within each of the individual EULs. It does not go beyond that. So common areas outside of the EULs, we can't mandate the PD have a requirement to provide security there. With that said, as part of the community backbone that we're looking at, that is something that they have offered to work with VA on how to provide that.
Great, thank you. And, just being a housing provider and a social worker by training and working mostly in transitional, not so much permanent supportive housing, but kind of seeing how, when Sepulveda, the two buildings up on Sepulveda campus rolled out, some of the issues that the Addictive Behaviors Clinic had up there and with some of those issues, the way the parcel release is now trickling down south of Nimitz, it's a little bit concerning because, really this campus should be for all veterans. And the way this parcel release looks, it looks like we're turning it into one big permanent supportive housing place with some mixed use on the bottom. And that just, to me, that doesn't say like, I want to bring my family there. We can't live in a utopia. If there's a lot of actively using veterans that are out front or veterans struggling with mental health and responding to internal stimuli hanging around the building, the community and other veterans are not going to want to use that space. One of my friends said that, think about it. Like, would you ever want your family to go to, say, like, let's go to Villages of Cabrillo? That's been used as a model for this work. I don't think anybody wants to, tell their family, hey, let's go check out Villages of Cabrillo, unless we live there. So I think that's kind of my big concern is the way this is looking. It looks like we're just turning this into a big supportive housing unit, and it's really kind of going to cut off access for the rest of the veteran community. And so I just wanted to say that piece.
Dr. Benberger.
I just want to comment on the Allman University housing idea at 415, 413, 14. So just kidding. So I try to stay in my lane and share with you experience as a physician. And I can't tell you how many times I've cared for people in San Francisco who've moved to San Francisco to go to the Academy of Arts on the GI Bill. And then I see them a year later homeless. This is a very common feeder for homelessness in this country, and it breaks my heart because people come to the very expensive city of San Francisco thinking that this is going to be their chance, and then they either don't do well or can't get a job at Pixar and end up on the streets. The idea of using the GI Bill as a funding source for housing is brilliant. I think this is fantastic, Anthony. And we use HUD-VASH as a way to basically go to banks and get loans. And that works really well for developers when they can have the cost of the land handed to them. This is another fantastic strategy to use existing funding through the GI Bill to anchor development of housing to prevent some of our most vulnerable young people from becoming homeless. And I've never heard this concept before of using the GI Bill for development of housing, but I think it's fantastic. And I really am excited to hear you present this to us. And I think that we should really explore with our development partners if this could be a strategy to expand housing and stop the inflow of homelessness, which is crushing us. For every person I house, 2 more before become homeless. This is great. So thank you for bringing this idea to us.
Thanks, Josh. I appreciate
Let me just a second, Anthony. Let me get John Kuhn, who's online.
Yeah, I wanted to lend my voice. Josh, I'm glad to hear your support for this too. I think Anthony's idea is certainly one worth exploring. We do need to look at opportunities to make this a more mixed community. We don't want to create a situation where, as Jim described, it's a place that no one wants to go to. We know mixed communities are more sustainable, more desirable. If we make a community that we know is going to be composed of folks who have high rates of mental illness and substance use disorders, we're at risk of creating this very large open psychiatric ward. So we have, I think it would be in our benefit to start thinking about what a mixed community could look like, where we serve at-risk folks as well as folks who are unsheltered. So that way we can create a community that people want to live in.
Sir, can I add one more?
Thank you, John. Anthony?
Yeah, I just want to be just very clear here with respect to 413, 414, 415. I do think that this is absolutely consistent with the existing EUL authority and the principal developer selection. So I'm not advocating that this is somehow separate and apart from the master EUL or whatever we're calling it. I think that this is in line with it. Whereas for literally years now, I've been saying that the town center concept was not. So I just wanted to be clear that, you know, I think that this is 100% within the existing EUL authority specific to this campus.
Okay, thank you, Anthony. Brett, Josh, let me just get a question in here and I'll get with you, okay? So just to go back and get into somebody's pocket, we've all been excited about the $360 million in infusion. How does that relate to the parcel release plan? Is that fully funded now going forward in the master plan 2022?
It's a great question. So I think the short answer is it's fully funded to the extent that we know what the requirements are. And that unfortunately does change as we develop some of these buildings, you know, the infrastructure components of those buildings until we get to them, we're assessing at sort of the outside what we think that's going to cost. Same thing with the utility components. And that's an important aspect. Even if we keep everything on the map as it is right now, there's an assumption about a cost of utilities. And as Brian Penn, it could be 100 million, could be more, could be less, but in that range, if we change things as we move forward, which is completely viable that we could do, those costs could change. So the short answer is today, we believe that it fully funds the requirement from the VA standpoint. Again, this doesn't help the PD on their financing, but from the VA standpoint, we believe it does. There is additional money in that bucket. So the 391 roughly is part of the overall $922 million allocated to be used for entering into EULs under the PACT Act. We've got certainly lots of other EULs across the country that are using some of this funding. West LA is our biggest development, therefore is using the biggest amount of money, but we've not allocated all of that 922. So it is possible if we need to go up or down from there, there is additional money.
Okay, thank you. Anthony, are you still up?
And sorry, one more point of clarification because I know it's all new information. With respect to 408, 407, 410, 409, and 13, it's not, don't ever think about developing it. I just don't think that the timing is appropriate right now when we are about to, you know, according to the current parcel release schedule, May 2024, I think it's really premature. And so maybe we come back to it. Maybe something else happens. I don't know. But I think we just need some time. Maybe we can use that space to fill in the northern community, do whatever we need to do for potentially student veteran housing, and then come back to this area once, potentially maybe after Master Plan 2025.
Okay, I see no further questions. Mr. Sims, thanks very much. We certainly appreciate the information and your time and frankly your effort all across this spectrum.
Thank you.